Tonight we're embarking on a journey that spans over 3,000 years, a journey through the birth, the glory, and the slow, inevitable death of one of humanity's most influential belief systems, Greek mythology. You know the names: Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon. Gods who shaped civilizations, inspired empires, and still echo through our culture today. But where did these stories actually come from? How did they rise to dominate the ancient world? And perhaps most hauntingly, how did they fall? This is the complete story. From the Bronze Age palaces where these gods were first whispered into existence, through the golden temples of classical Athens where they reigned supreme, to the cold Christian churches built atop their ruins. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's watch an entire mythology be born, flourish, and die. Long before Homer sang of Troy, long before the Parthenon rose above Athens, the seeds of Greek mythology were planted in the rich soil of the Bronze Age Aegean. We're travelling back to around 2000 BCE, to a world of palaces and kings, of mysterious scripts and buried treasures. This is where our story begins, not in the Greece you might imagine, but in a civilization that would vanish so completely that even the classical Greeks barely remembered it existed. The Minoan civilization on Crete emerged around 2600 BCE, building elaborate multi-story palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and other sites across the island. These weren't just royal residences, they were sprawling complexes that served as administrative centres, religious sanctuaries, and economic hubs all at once. The walls were painted with vibrant frescoes showing religious processions, bull-leaping ceremonies, and mysterious rituals we can only guess at today. Here, in these labyrinthine corridors, the earliest forms of what would become Greek religion began to take shape. The Minoans worshipped differently than the Greeks who would follow them. Their pantheon was simpler, dominated by female deities, rather than the patriarchal structure that would characterize classical Greek religion. Archaeological evidence points to a central mother goddess figure, often depicted holding snakes in both hands. These weren't the elegant marble statues of later Greece. These were earthier, more primal images of divine feminine power. Scholars have identified several goddesses in Minoan art: a war goddess, a sea goddess, a mistress of animals who commanded the beasts, and a nude goddess associated with birds, possibly doves. Male gods existed too, but they were surprisingly rare in Minoan religion. The most prominent was the master of animals, a young man typically shown holding a spear, often depicted worshipping the great mother goddess herself. This tells us something crucial about the religious world that would eventually feed into Greek mythology. The power dynamic would shift dramatically, but the raw material, the basic concept of divine beings controlling natural forces and human fate, was already present. Then came the Mycenaeans. Around 1750 BCE, Indo-European-speaking peoples migrated into mainland Greece, bringing with them a warrior culture that would fundamentally reshape the religious landscape. The Mycenaeans looked at the sophisticated Minoan civilization to their south and absorbed everything they could. They adopted Minoan art, architecture, religious practices, and probably many of their myths, but they filtered it all through their own more militaristic, patriarchal worldview. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans had essentially taken over Crete itself, and we see the first written evidence of what would become Greek religion. They used a script called Linear B, an early form of the Greek language, to keep administrative records. And in these mundane accounting tablets, written by bureaucrats tracking grain shipments and livestock, we find something extraordinary. The names of gods. Zeus appears, Poseidon appears, and interestingly, he seems to have been the most important god during the Mycenaean period, not Zeus. Hera is there. Athena is mentioned. Apollo, Ares, Dionysus, possibly Hermes. All these names, carved in clay over 3,000 years ago, proving that the Olympian gods didn't spring fully formed from Homer's imagination. They were already being worshipped, already receiving offerings, already shaping the spiritual lives of Bronze Age Greeks. But here's what's fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. We have the names, but we don't have the stories. These tablets are bureaucratic records. They tell us that someone delivered wine to Poseidon's sanctuary, or that a certain amount of grain was set aside for Zeus. They don't tell us the myths, the relationships between gods, the epic tales that would later define Greek mythology. Those stories were being passed down orally, sung by bards, told around fires, woven into the fabric of Bronze Age culture. But they weren't being written down. Not yet. The Mycenaean civilization built impressive fortifications at sites like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos. These weren't just military installations. They were palace complexes that served as centres of power, controlling vast territories through a sophisticated bureaucratic system. The walls at Mycenae were so massive that later Greeks, unable to imagine how human beings could have moved such enormous stones, attributed their construction to the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants of myth. The famous Lion Gate still stands there today, the lions carved in stone watching over an entrance that's been silent for over 3 millennia. This was an age of heroes, or so later Greeks believed. The Trojan War, if it happened at all, would have occurred during the late Mycenaean period, around 1200 BCE. The great heroes of myth, Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, Heracles, Theseus, all these legendary figures were associated with the Mycenaean age in Greek memory. Whether they were real people, composites of many, individuals or pure fiction doesn't really matter for our purposes. What matters is that the Greeks of later ages looked back to this Bronze Age world as a time when heroes walked the earth, when mortals could speak with gods, when the boundaries between the human and divine were thin and permeable. The religious practices of Mycenaean Greece borrowed heavily from the Minoans, but adapted them to fit their own culture. Temples weren't yet the massive stone structures they would become. Religious worship happened at various locations, altars in palaces, sacred groves, mountaintop sanctuaries, cave shrines. The gods were seen as present in the landscape itself, inhabiting springs and rivers, mountains and forests. This animistic thread would never completely disappear from Greek religion, even in its most sophisticated philosophical forms. But all of this, the palaces, the wealth, the complex society, the emerging mythology, all of it was about to come crashing down. Around 1200 BCE, catastrophe struck, not just Greece, but the entire eastern Mediterranean world. The Bronze Age was ending, and it was ending in fire. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's great mysteries. Over the course of about 50 years, from roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was severely weakened. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia gone, Mycenaean Greece destroyed, major cities from Troy to Gaza burned to the ground. Even mighty Egypt, which survived, was left reeling from invasions and internal chaos. In Greece, the effect was devastating. The great palace centres were destroyed one by one. Mycenae burned, Pylos burned, Thebes was abandoned, Tiryns fell. The archaeological evidence shows destruction layers at site after site, ash and rubble marking the end of a civilization. And what's most telling, over 90% of the smaller settlements in the Peloponnese were abandoned. The population didn't just relocate, it crashed. People were dying, fleeing, scattered to the winds. What caused this collapse? Scholars have debated this for decades, and the truth is probably that no single cause explains it. Climate change. There's evidence of severe drought and cooling in the Mediterranean starting around 1200 BCE. The region's crops would have failed, famine would have followed, earthquakes and natural disasters. The archaeological record shows seismic damage at many sites. Invasion by the mysterious sea peoples, groups of raiders and displaced populations who attacked Egypt and other regions. Internal rebellion. The palace economy of Mycenaean Greece may have been so unequal, so exploitative, that the common people finally rose up against their rulers. Probably it was all of these things feeding into each other. Climate change causing crop failures, leading to famine, leading to internal unrest, leading to raids and warfare, all spiralling into a cascade of societal collapse. Whatever the exact mix of causes, the result was clear. The Mycenaean civilization was gone, and with it went everything that made it a civilization. Writing disappeared. The Linear B script, with all its administrative records and divine names, was forgotten. Literacy would not return to Greece for 300 to 400 years. Trade networks collapsed. The luxury goods, the gold and ivory and fine pottery that had connected the Mycenaean world to Egypt and the Near East, all of that ceased. Monumental architecture stopped. No more massive fortification walls, no more palace complexes. Art became simpler, cruder. The sophisticated figurative pottery of the Mycenaean age gave way to basic geometric patterns. The population that remained lived in small, isolated villages. The complex social hierarchies of the palace system were gone, replaced by simpler kinship-based societies. Chiefs might have existed, but they weren't kings in the Mycenaean sense. They were more like prominent landowners, first among equals. Life became local, focused on survival, rather than the grand ambitions of empire. This period, from about 1100 to 800 BCE, used to be called the Greek Dark Ages, and that name stuck because it seemed accurate. Dark, not just in the sense of violence and destruction, but dark in the sense of obscurity. We know so little about these centuries. With no writing, we have no records, no texts, no documentation of events. We have only what archaeology can tell us: pottery styles and burial practices, the slow changes in settlement patterns, the gradual reappearance of trade connections. But recent scholarship has pushed back against viewing this period as entirely dark. Yes, it was a time of reduced material culture and population. Yes, complex civilization had collapsed. But life continued, communities adapted, and crucially for our story, the myth survived. The stories of gods and heroes that had been told in Mycenaean palaces continued to be told around village fires. Bards still sang of Zeus and Athena, of Heracles and his labours, of the war at Troy and the wanderings of Odysseus. This oral tradition was the lifeline connecting Bronze Age religion to what would emerge in the Archaic period. The bards, the singers, the storytellers kept the flame alive through centuries of darkness. They modified the stories, added to them, changed details to fit their own times, but they preserved the essential framework. The gods remained. Their names, their basic characteristics, their relationships to each other and to humanity, all of this survived the collapse. Athens was one of the few places that didn't completely collapse. The Acropolis remained occupied through the Dark Ages, serving as a refuge and a jumping-off point for Greeks fleeing eastward to the Aegean Islands and the coast of Asia Minor. This migration, traditionally called the Ionian migration, would have profound consequences. These displaced Mycenaean Greeks carried their stories, their religious practices, their cultural identity across the sea to new lands. And in those new settlements, particularly in Ionia on the western coast of what's now Turkey, Greek culture would eventually begin to revive. Iron replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons. This wasn't just a technological shift, it was symbolic. The Bronze Age was over, the Age of Heroes was past. This was the Iron Age, and as the poet Hesiod would later write, it was a harder, cruder, more brutal age than what had come before. Life expectancy was shorter, material culture poorer, the memory of past glories a source of both inspiration and melancholy. Yet even in this darkness, the seeds of recovery were germinating. Small communities were learning to work iron from local deposits, something that didn't require the long-distance trade networks bronze had demanded. Geometric pottery styles emerged, particularly at Athens, showing that artistic innovation hadn't completely died. By about 900 BCE, population began to slowly increase again. Trade connections, tentative at first, started to reform, particularly with the Levant and Cyprus, and the gods waited. Zeus still ruled the heavens, even if his temples were simple altars instead of grand palaces. Poseidon still commanded the seas that Greeks sailed. Athena still watched over Athens from the Acropolis. The myths were being refined in the darkness, being shaped by generations of bards into the forms they would take when finally, after centuries of silence, the Greeks would learn to write again. The stage was set for mythology's great transformation. It would emerge from these dark centuries not weaker, but stronger, more vivid, more fully realised than ever before. The stories had been tested by time, polished by countless retellings, shaped by the collective imagination of a people who clung to their myths even as their civilization crumbled around them. When writing returned to Greece, when temples rose again in stone, when the city-states formed and flourished, Greek mythology would be ready. The gods had survived the darkness, now they would step into the light. Around 800 BCE, something remarkable happened. The Greeks learned to write again. Not the syllabic linear B of their Mycenaean ancestors, but a new alphabetic system borrowed from the Phoenicians and adapted to the Greek language. This alphabet was revolutionary. Unlike previous writing systems, it included symbols for vowels, making it the first true alphabet in human history. And more importantly for our story, it was relatively easy to learn, meaning literacy could spread beyond a small scribal class. At roughly the same time, or perhaps slightly earlier, two poets were at work who would fundamentally shape how Greek mythology would be understood for all time. Homer and Hesiod. These names have echoed through history for nearly 3,000 years. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed that Homer and Hesiod created Greek religion. That's an overstatement, of course. The gods existed before these poets. But Herodotus wasn't entirely wrong. Homer and Hesiod took the sprawling, contradictory, localized traditions of Greek religion and forged them into something more coherent, more universal, more powerful. Homer, whoever he was or they were, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. These weren't religious texts in the way we might understand them today. They were epic poems, stories of war and adventure, designed to entertain aristocratic audiences at feasts and gatherings. But woven throughout these tales were the gods, Zeus presiding over the conflict at Troy, sending omens and making decisions about which mortal heroes would live or die. Athena guiding her favourite, Odysseus, helping him survive his long journey home. Poseidon pursuing a grudge against that same hero, making his voyage a nightmare of storms and monsters. Apollo sending plague into the Greek camp, Aphrodite protecting Paris. Hera scheming against the Trojans. These weren't distant, unknowable deities. Homer's gods had personalities, desires, jealousies, and flaws. They argued with each other, formed factions, changed their minds, interfered in mortal affairs for petty reasons. They were, in many ways, like an aristocratic family writ large and divine. This anthropomorphism, this making of gods in humanity's image, wasn't new. The Mycenaeans had already started down this path, influenced by Minoan religion. But Homer crystallized it, gave it narrative form, made it vivid and immediate. The Iliad in particular became a kind of cultural encyclopedia for the Greeks, not just a story about the Trojan War, but a compendium of proper behaviour, religious practice, social values, how to treat guests, how to conduct warfare, how to speak with eloquence, how to honour the gods. Young aristocrats throughout the Greek world would memorise vast passages of Homer. The poems became part of their education, their cultural identity, their understanding of what it meant to be Greek. But Homer left gaps. His focus was on heroes and their deeds, on the Trojan War and Odysseus's wanderings. He didn't explain where the gods came from, how they were related, what their domains were beyond the immediate context of his stories. That's where Hesiod came in. Hesiod was a very different kind of poet from Homer. He wasn't composing for aristocratic feasts. He was a farmer in Boeotia who claimed that the muses themselves had appeared to him while he was shepherding on Mount Helicon and commanded him to sing of the gods. Whether this divine encounter actually happened or was a literary device doesn't really matter. What matters is what Hesiod produced. The theogony. Theogony, which translates roughly as the birth of the gods, was the first systematic account of Greek mythology. Hesiod traced the genealogy of the gods from the very beginning of creation. "In the beginning was chaos," he wrote, "a yawning void. From chaos came Gaia, the earth, and then Eros, representing desire, and various other primordial beings. Gaia bore Uranus, the sky, and together they produced the Titans, including Cronus and his wife Rhea. Cronus, fearing prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, swallowed each child as they were born, but Rhea saved the youngest, Zeus, by hiding him on Crete and giving Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead. Zeus grew to maturity, freed his siblings from Cronus's belly, and led them in a 10-year war against the Titans. This cosmic battle, the Titanomachy, ended with Zeus and his siblings victorious. They established themselves on Mount Olympus, with Zeus as their king. This is the foundational myth of Greek religion, a succession myth showing how divine power passed from one generation to the next through violence and cunning. Zeus's victory over Cronus echoed Cronus's earlier overthrow of Uranus. It established Zeus as the supreme deity, but it also showed that even divine power had limits, that it had to be won and maintained, that the cosmos itself had a history of conflict and change. Hesiod didn't stop with creation and divine succession. He mapped out the relationships between gods, explained their domains and functions, connected them in a vast family tree that gave structure to what might otherwise have been a confusing tangle of local cults and contradictory stories. Zeus ruled the sky and was the king of gods. Poseidon governed the seas. Hades reigned over the underworld. Hera was Zeus's wife and queen of the gods. Athena was goddess of wisdom and warfare. Apollo commanded music, prophecy, and healing. Artemis was mistress of wild animals and the hunt. Aphrodite embodied love and beauty. Ares represented war's brutality. Hephaestus was the divine craftsman. Hermes served as messenger, and on and on. Hesiod also wrote Works and Days, a poem about farming, justice, and how to live a good life. This work is less obviously mythological, but it contains some of mythology's most famous stories. The tale of Pandora, the first woman created by the gods as punishment for humanity, and sent to earth with a jar full of evils that she unleashed upon the world. The Ages of Man, describing how humanity had declined from a golden age through silver, bronze, and finally to Hesiod's own Iron Age. Together, Homer and Hesiod didn't just record Greek mythology, they shaped it, standardized it, gave it narrative power and philosophical depth that would influence everything that came after. Other poets would add to the tradition. The so-called epic cycle filled in gaps in the Trojan war story. The Homeric hymns praised individual gods with their own myths and attributes. But Homer and Hesiod remained central, authoritative, the touchstones to which later Greeks would return again and again. And all of this was being written down. That's the crucial development. For the first time since the Linear B, tablets of the Bronze Age, Greeks were recording their myths in permanent form. But unlike those administrative records, these were literary texts, meant to be performed, recited, copied, spread from city to city across the Greek world. The oral tradition continued. Bards still sang the old stories at festivals and feasts. But now those stories had a fixed form, a reference point, a way to be preserved beyond any individual bard's memory. This created something remarkable, a shared mythology that could transcend local boundaries. Athens had its favourite stories about Theseus and Athena. Thebes had the tragic cycle of Oedipus and his family. Argos celebrated Perseus and the conquest of the sea monster. Every city, every region had its own mythic traditions. But Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks a common framework, a way to see themselves as part of a larger whole, bound together not by politics or empire, but by shared stories, shared gods, shared culture. The gods were now literary figures as well as objects of worship. Their personalities were fixed in epic verse, their relationships codified in divine genealogy, Their stories known from Athens to the shores of Asia Minor to the colonies being established in Sicily and southern Italy. Greek mythology had taken its mature form. The gods had stepped out of the darkness and into the light of written tradition, and just in time. Because the Archaic period was dawning, and with it would come temples of stone, festivals of unprecedented splendour, and the slow birth of philosophy that would begin to question the very nature of these gods so lovingly described by the poets. By 800 BCE, Greece was transforming. Population was growing rapidly after the long stagnation of the Dark Ages. Small villages were coalescing into larger settlements, and most importantly, a new form of political and social organisation was emerging, the polis, the city-state. This wasn't just a city in the modern sense. Each polis was an independent political entity, a community of citizens who governed themselves, worshipped their own patron deities, and fiercely defended their autonomy. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, dozens and eventually hundreds of these city-states would dot the Greek landscape and the wider Mediterranean world as colonization spread. The polis transformed Greek religion in profound ways. Each city-state needed to define itself, to create a civic identity that bound its citizens together, and religion became central to that identity. Every polis had its patron deity, the god or goddess who was seen as special protector of that city. Athens had Athena, Sparta had Apollo, Corinth had Aphrodite. These weren't just spiritual relationships, they were political ones. To be a citizen of Athens meant to worship Athena in particular ways, to participate in her festivals, to contribute to her temples. And those temples, that's where we see one of the most dramatic transformations of the Archaic period. In the Dark Ages and early Archaic period, worship happened at simple altars, in sacred groves, at modest shrines. But starting in the 8th century BCE, and accelerating through the 7th and 6th centuries, Greeks began building permanent temples. These weren't worship spaces in the way we might think of churches or mosques. The Greeks didn't gather inside temples for religious services. Instead, temples were houses for the gods. They contained cult statues, representations of the deity that were believed to embody the divine presence. Worship happened outside, at altars where sacrifices were performed. The first temples were small, made of wood and mud brick with thatched roofs. But as city-states grew wealthier, as trade expanded and colonies sent back riches, temple architecture became increasingly ambitious. Stone replaced wood, columns multiplied, decoration grew more elaborate. By the 6th century BCE, the Greeks had developed two main architectural orders: the Doric style predominant in mainland Greece and the western colonies, characterized by sturdy columns with simple capitals, and the Ionic style favoured in the eastern Greek settlements of Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands, featuring more slender columns with scroll-shaped capitals. The Temple of Apollo at Corinth, built around 540 BCE, is one of the earliest surviving examples of monumental Doric architecture. 7 of its original 38 columns still stand today, massive stones weathered by 25 centuries, but still radiating an austere power. At Ephesus on the coast of Asia Minor, the Temple of Artemis was one of the largest Greek temples ever built, a marvel of Ionic architecture that would be listed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At Samos, the tyrant Polycrates commissioned an enormous temple to Hera, that required innovative engineering to support its massive scale. These temples were more than just religious structures. They were statements of civic pride and ambition. A magnificent temple showed that a city was wealthy, powerful, favoured by the gods. The construction itself could be a multi-generational project, employing hundreds of workers, requiring quarrying and transport of massive stones, demanding the skills of architects, sculptors, painters, and craftsmen of every kind. When completed, these temples became the visual focal points of the polis, dominating the landscape, visible from miles away, proclaiming the glory of both the god and the city. The cult statues housed within these temples were objects of intense devotion and artistic achievement. In the Archaic period, sculptors were learning to carve large-scale human figures from stone for the first time in Greek history, inspired partly by contact with Egypt. The Kouroi and Korai, statues of young men and women, began to appear. These weren't realistic portraits. They were idealized representations, stylized and formal, with their characteristic archaic smile and frontal stance. Many were offerings to the gods dedicated at sanctuaries and temples. The best might serve as cult images, the physical embodiment of the deity for purposes of worship. But temples weren't the only way Greeks honoured their gods. Panhellenic sanctuaries, religious sites that belonged not to any single city but to all Greeks, became increasingly important during the Archaic period. The four most famous were Olympia, site of the Olympic Games held every 4 years in honour of Zeus, Delphi, home of Apollo's oracle and the Pythian Games, Nemea, where games honoured Zeus, and the Isthmus of Corinth, where games celebrated Poseidon. These sanctuaries served multiple functions. Most obviously they were religious centres where Greeks from all over the Mediterranean world could come to honour the gods, make offerings, seek divine guidance. But they were also social and political meeting grounds. The athletic competitions at these sites weren't just sports. They were performances of civic identity and individual excellence. Winners brought glory not just to themselves but to their entire city-state. The sanctuary spaces became showcases where cities could compete in piety and magnificence, building elaborate treasuries to house their offerings, commissioning statues and monuments, demonstrating their devotion and their wealth. Delphi in particular deserves special attention. The sanctuary of Apollo there was believed to be the centre of the world, the omphalos or navel of the cosmos. The oracle of Delphi, a priestess called the Pythia, who would enter a trance state and deliver Apollo's pronouncements, became the most famous oracle in the Greek world. City-states consulted the oracle before making major decisions, whether to go to war, where to found a colony, how to respond to crisis. Wealthy individuals came seeking advice on personal matters. The oracle's responses were notoriously ambiguous, allowing for multiple interpretations, but that didn't diminish her authority. The belief that Apollo spoke through his priestess at Delphi was nearly universal in the Greek world. Colonization also transformed Greek religion during the Archaic period. Facing land shortages and population pressure, many Greek cities sent out colonists to found new settlements around the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. These colonists took their gods with them. A colony of Corinth would worship Corinthian deities in Corinthian ways. But distance and contact with non-Greek peoples also allowed for religious innovation. Local gods might be identified with Greek ones in a process called syncretism. Foreign religious ideas could influence Greek practice, and the very act of founding a new city created opportunities for religious expression as colonists established temples, instituted festivals, and created new civic cults. The Archaic period also saw the rise of tyrants, autocratic rulers who seized power in many city-states. This might sound negative to modern ears, but Greek tyranny wasn't always oppressive. Many tyrants, like Pisistratus in Athens or Polycrates in Samos, were effective rulers who brought stability and prosperity to their cities, and many of them used religion as a tool of governance and legitimation. Pisistratus reorganized Athens' most important festivals, particularly the Pantheon, honouring Athena, and the city Dionysia, celebrating Dionysus. He built or expanded temples. He promoted Athens as a religious centre, enhancing the city's prestige and binding its population together through shared ritual and myth. The Eleusinian Mysteries, secret religious rites held at Eleusis near Athens, also rose to prominence during this period. Unlike most Greek religion, which was public and communal, the mysteries were initiatory. Those who were initiated, who underwent the secret rituals and saw the sacred objects revealed only to initiates, were promised a better afterlife than the grim, shadowy existence most Greeks expected after death. We don't know exactly what happened in the mysteries. The initiates were bound by sacred oaths never to reveal what they had seen, but we know the mysteries honoured Demeter and her daughter Persephone, and they apparently involved reenactment of Persephone's abduction by Hades and eventual return. This points to something important about archaic Greek religion. It was becoming more personal, more concerned with individual spiritual experience. The earlier focus had been almost entirely on community ritual, on maintaining the proper relationship between the polis and its gods through public sacrifices and festivals. The mysteries didn't replace that communal religion, but they supplemented it, offering something more intimate, a personal relationship with the divine that promised genuine transformation and hope for the afterlife. As the Archaic period progressed into its final decades, the 6th century BCE, the groundwork had been laid for Greek religion's golden age. The gods had their stone houses, their myths had been recorded and standardized by Homer and Hesiod. Their festivals brought communities together in displays of civic unity and religious devotion. The great pan-Hellenic sanctuaries linked the dispersed Greek world in a shared religious identity. Mystery cults offered personal spiritual fulfillment, and across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to the Black Sea, Greek colonists were spreading these beliefs and practices to new lands. But storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The Persian Empire was expanding westward. The Greeks of Asia Minor were already under Persian control, and in 490 BCE, then again in 480 BCE, Persian armies would invade mainland Greece itself, threatening not just Greek political independence, but the very cultural and religious identity the Greeks had been building through centuries of patient effort. The response to this existential threat would usher in Greek mythology's greatest flowering, the Classical period. The Persian Wars changed everything. When King Darius of Persia sent a punitive expedition to punish Athens for supporting the rebellious Greek cities of Asia Minor, he probably didn't expect what happened. At Marathon in 490 BCE, a heavily outnumbered Athenian force, aided by Plataea, decisively defeated the Persian landing force. This victory sent shockwaves through the Greek world. The great Persian Empire, which controlled territory from India to Egypt, had been beaten by a single Greek city-state. 10 years later, Darius's son Xerxes tried again with a much larger force, a massive army and fleet that represented the greatest military expedition the ancient world had yet seen. This time the Greeks banded together, led by Sparta on land and Athens at sea. The heroic sacrifice at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies held off the Persian army for 3 days before being outflanked and killed to the last man, became instant legend. The naval victory at Salamis, where the Greek fleet destroyed much of the Persian navy in the narrow straits off Athens, turned the tide. And the final land victory at Plataea in 479 BCE secured Greek independence. The Greeks didn't just attribute these victories to military prowess. They saw them as religious vindication, proof that the gods favoured Greek civilization over Persian barbarism. Athens in particular emerged from the Persian Wars with immense prestige and confidence. The Athenians had sacrificed their city, evacuating the population while Xerxes' army burned the Acropolis and destroyed its temples. But they had won anyway through courage, cunning, and divine favour. Now, with Persian threat receding and Athens leading a naval empire through the Delian League, the Athenians set about rebuilding on a scale never before attempted. Under the leadership of Pericles in the mid-5th century BCE, Athens became the cultural and intellectual centre of the Greek world. Pericles proposed using the Delian League's treasury, technically meant for defence against Persia, to rebuild Athens's temples and beautify the city. This was controversial. Many of Athens's allies saw it as misappropriation of funds, but Pericles pushed it through. The result was the greatest building programme in Greek history. The Parthenon dominated this effort. Built atop the Acropolis between 447 and 432 BCE, the Parthenon was Athens's gift to its patron goddess Athena. Everything about it was designed to inspire awe. The architects Ictinus and Callicrates incorporated subtle curves into what appears to be straight lines, optical refinements that make the building seem perfectly balanced to the human eye. The sculptor Phidias supervised the elaborate decorative program, including a massive chryselephantine statue of Athena inside the temple, 40 feet tall, made of gold and ivory, showing the goddess in full armour, holding Nike, the goddess of victory, in her outstretched hand. The Parthenon's sculptural decoration told multiple mythological stories. The east pediment showed Athena's birth, springing fully armed from Zeus's head. The west pediment depicted Athena's contest with Poseidon for patronage of Athens, with Athena winning by giving the city the olive tree. The metopes, square panels running around the building's exterior, showed various mythological battles: Greeks versus Amazons, Lapiths versus Centaurs, gods versus giants, Greeks versus Trojans. All of these represented order triumphing over chaos, civilization over barbarism, a none too subtle parallel to Greece's victory over Persia. And then there was the frieze, a continuous band of sculpture running around the interior colonnade, showing the Panathenaic procession. This was Athens's most important festival, held annually but with special magnificence every 4 years. The procession wound through the city and up to the Acropolis, featuring cavalry, musicians, water carriers, sacrifice animals, and most importantly a new peplos, an elaborate woven garment that would be presented to Athena's ancient wooden cult statue housed in the nearby Erechtheion. By depicting this civic ritual in the frieze, the Parthenon visually linked Athens's present to its mythological past, showing Athenian citizens participating in the same religious rites their ancestors had performed. Other buildings joined the Parthenon on the Acropolis: the Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the sacred precinct, the Temple of Athena Nike, celebrating the goddess as bringer of victory, the Erechtheion, a structurally complex temple housing multiple ancient cults, including Athena Polias, the city protecting Athena, and Poseidon Erechtheus. The famous caryatids, columns in the shape of women, held up one of the Erechtheion's porches. These buildings weren't just art and architecture. They were active religious sites. Animal sacrifices were performed at altars. Priests and priestesses tended the sacred spaces. Festivals brought thousands of participants and spectators. Votive offerings accumulated, gifts to the gods from both individuals and the state. The Acropolis became Athens' sacred heart, the physical manifestation of the city's relationship with its divine protector. But the classical period wasn't just about building temples. It was also the great age of Greek festivals, elaborate multi-day celebrations that combined religious ritual, athletic competition, theatrical performance, and communal feasting. Athens alone celebrated around 120 festival days per year. Some were small, local affairs. Others were massive citywide events. The Panathenea, as mentioned, was Athens's most important festival to Athena, culminating in the procession depicted on the Parthenon frieze. The city Dionysia, held in spring, was the main festival of Dionysus, god of wine, theatre, and ecstatic release. This festival featured tragic and comic drama competitions that produced many of the masterworks we still read today: Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes. These playwrights premiered their works at the city Dionysia, telling mythological stories with such power that they shaped how Greeks understood their gods and heroes. The theatre was more than entertainment. It was religious ritual. Performances began with sacrifice to Dionysus. The theatre of Dionysus on the south slope of the Acropolis was sacred space, and the plays themselves were often meditations on theology, morality, fate, and humanity's relationship with the divine. Aeschylus's Oresteia explored justice, revenge, and the evolution of divine and human law. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex confronted fate, free will, and the limits of human knowledge. Euripides' Bacchae showed Dionysus destroying those who denied his divinity. These weren't abstract philosophical treatises. They were vivid, emotional, immediate explorations of religious and moral questions, performed before audiences of thousands of Athenian citizens. The Eleusinian mysteries reached their peak influence during the classical period. Anyone who spoke Greek and hadn't committed murder could be initiated, regardless of age, sex, or social status. This democratic openness, combined with the promise of a better afterlife, made the mysteries enormously popular. Important figures from across the Greek world made the pilgrimage to Eleusis to be initiated. The great procession from Athens to Eleusis, carrying sacred objects along the sacred way, was one of Athens's most important religious events. Oracles continued to play a major role in religious life. The Pythia at Delphi was consulted on everything from personal problems to questions of war and peace. City-states sent theoroi, sacred ambassadors, to Delphi to ask Apollo's advice. While some philosophers and intellectuals were skeptical of oracles, most Greeks believed that the gods could and did communicate with mortals through these channels. Other oracular sites existed too. Zeus's oracle at Dodona, where prophecies were delivered through the rustling of oak leaves. The oracle of Trophonios at Lebedia, where consultants underwent terrifying descent into an underground cave. The oracle of Apollo at Didymar in Asia Minor. Sacrifice remained central to Greek religious practice. Every important event required sacrifice. Before battles, at the start of assemblies, at marriages and funerals, at festivals great and small, animals were slaughtered at altars and their meat consumed in communal feasts. This wasn't crude or primitive. It was a highly ritualized practice governed by precise rules. The animal had to be perfect, without blemish. Water was poured over it, and if it nodded its head, this was taken as the animal's consent. Barley grain was sprinkled. Hairs from the animal's head were cut and thrown in the fire. Only then was the throat cut and the blood collected to pour on the altar. The thigh bones and fat were burned for the gods, who were believed to enjoy the ascending smoke. The rest of the meat was butchered and distributed among the participants. But even as Greek religion reached its peak of public magnificence and civic importance, seeds of doubt were being planted. The classical period was also the great age of Greek philosophy. Thinkers like Xenophanes had already in the 6th century criticized Homer and Hesiod for attributing human faults to the gods. Heraclitus had proclaimed that there was one logos, one divine reason, governing all things, implicitly challenging the multiplicity of traditional deities. Now, in the 5th century, this critique intensified. The sophists, itinerant teachers who moved from city to city, taught rhetoric and argumentation. Some of them questioned traditional religion. Protagoras famously said he couldn't know whether the gods existed or what they were like. Critias suggested that religion was a clever invention by ancient lawgivers to enforce morality by making people think the gods were watching. These were dangerous ideas, the kind that could get someone prosecuted for impiety. And someone was. In 399 BCE, the philosopher Socrates was put on trial in Athens, charged with impiety and corrupting the youth. The real reasons were probably political. Socrates had been associated with several Athenians who had become enemies of the restored democracy after Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War. But the charges were couched in religious terms. Socrates was accused of not believing in the city's gods and introducing new divine beings. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. Socrates' execution showed the tension at the heart of classical Greek religion. Public ritual and civic cult remained central to Greek political and social life. But intellectuals were increasingly questioning the literal truth of mythology. Could Zeus really have all those affairs? Did Apollo truly speak through the Pythia? Were the gods even distinct personalities, or were they all manifestations of some deeper divine principle? Plato, Socrates' student, would develop an entire philosophical system that radically reinterpreted traditional religion. In his dialogues, Plato argued for a transcendent realm of eternal forms beyond the physical world. The gods of mythology, if they existed at all, were imperfect shadows of true divinity. The many stories told about them were lies, or at best allegorical representations of deeper truths. This philosophical theology would profoundly influence later thinkers, but it was fundamentally at odds with traditional Greek religion. Yet traditional religion persisted. Most Greeks weren't philosophers. They continued to sacrifice at altars, participate in festivals, consult oracles, dedicate offerings at temples. The great sanctuaries continued to thrive. New temples were built. The civic cults that bound the polis together remained vibrant. Philosophy might question, but most people believed. The classical period represents Greek mythology at its peak of influence and sophistication. The gods had magnificent stone houses. Their festivals were elaborate civic celebrations. Their stories were performed in theatres, carved on temple pediments, painted on pottery, woven into the very fabric of Greek culture. But the classical period was also when the seeds of mythology's eventual decline were first planted, when philosophy began the long process of transforming literal belief into philosophical allegory, preparing the ground for the religious transformations that would come in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. All the grand temples and festivals, all the philosophical debates and poetic epics, they tell only part of the story. To truly understand Greek mythology's place in ancient life, we need to look at how ordinary Greeks, the farmers and craftsmen, the merchants and housewives, the slaves and soldiers, actually interacted with their gods on a day-to-day basis. Every Greek home had its own small shrine, a household altar where the family made offerings to protective deities. These weren't the Olympians, at least not primarily. These were the more modest gods of hearth and home. Hestia, goddess of the hearth fire that represented the household's centre and continuity. The household Zeus, Zeus Herkaios, who watched over the family's property and interests. Ancestors might be honoured, not as gods exactly, but as protective spirits who maintained an interest in their descendants' welfare. These household shrines saw constant use. Before meals, small portions of food and wine were set aside as offerings. Before leaving on a journey, prayers were offered. When someone returned home safely, thanksgiving was due. New brides were welcomed with rituals at the hearth. Newborn children were carried around it in a ceremony called the amphidromia that formally welcomed them into the family. The household cult was private, simple, but absolutely central to daily life. Beyond the home, every neighbourhood, every occupational group, every aspect of life had its associated deities. Farmers prayed to Demeter for good harvests and made offerings of the first fruits when crops came in. Sailors sacrificed to Poseidon before voyages and poured libations to him from their ships when in danger. Craftsmen honoured Hephaestus and Athena, the divine patrons of skilled work. Merchants travelling to new places might make offerings to Hermes, god of travellers, trade, and boundary crossing. Women in childbirth called on Artemis and Eileithyia. The sick sought healing at sanctuaries of Asclepius, the divine physician. These weren't mere superstitions or empty rituals. They reflected a worldview in which divine power permeated every aspect of existence. The Greeks didn't have our modern distinction between the natural and supernatural. Everything was natural, but everything also had its divine aspect. Rain fell because Zeus willed it. Crops grew because Demeter blessed them. Ships sank or sailed safely, according to Poseidon's mood. Disease came and went at the pleasure of various deities. This wasn't primitive thinking. It was a comprehensive system for understanding and engaging with a world that could be beautiful, terrifying, bountiful, and deadly by turns. Prayer was constant and ubiquitous in Greek life. But Greek prayer wasn't always what we might expect. It was transactional, based on the principle of reciprocity. Do ut des, I give so that you might give. A Greek praying to Athena might remind the goddess of past sacrifices and dedications, essentially saying, I've honoured you faithfully, now help me with this problem. This wasn't considered impious. It was simply how the relationship between humans and gods worked. The gods had their sphere of influence and power. Humans had their resources, their offerings, their devotion. Each side of the relationship had something the other wanted. Votive offerings filled sanctuaries across the Greek world. These were gifts to the gods, given in thanks for favours received or in hopes of favours to come. They ranged from the humble to the magnificent. A poor person might dedicate a simple clay figurine. A wealthy merchant might commission an elaborate bronze statue. City-states dedicated treasuries at Panhellenic sanctuaries, entire buildings to house their offerings. Athletes who won at the Olympic or Pythian Games dedicated statues of themselves, bronze or marble figures that proclaimed their excellence and the divine favour that made it possible. Some offerings were more specific. Those healed at sanctuaries of Asclepius might dedicate models of the body part that had been cured, a stone ear if hearing was restored, a clay leg if a limp was healed. Women thanking Artemis for surviving childbirth might dedicate clothing. Sailors saved from storms commissioned stone anchors or ship models to thank Poseidon. The archaeological record preserves thousands upon thousands of these offerings, each representing a moment when someone believed they had received divine help and wanted to express gratitude. Festivals we've discussed in terms of civic celebration, but they were also times when ordinary people could directly participate in religious life beyond their household cults. The great processions included citizens from all walks of life, each playing their assigned role. The sacrifices provided meat, a rare treat for poorer Greeks who normally couldn't afford it. The athletic contests and theatrical performances were public entertainment, free for citizens to attend. Festivals were holy days in the original sense, holidays, times when normal work stopped and the community came together in celebration. But religion also had its darker, more troubling aspects. The Greeks believed in binding curses, defixions, where someone could pay a ritual specialist to curse an enemy or rival. These curse tablets have been found by the hundreds, thin sheets of lead inscribed with curses and deposited in graves or sanctuaries of underworld deities. I bind the tongue of so-and-so that he may not speak against me in court. Let the wife of my rival become barren. May the chariot of the blue team crash in tomorrow's race. These weren't rare or marginal practices. They were common, showing that religion wasn't just about community and devotion. It could also be weaponized for personal advantage. Pollution and purification were constant concerns. Certain acts such as murder, childbirth, or contact with death created miasma, a kind of spiritual pollution that needed to be cleansed. This wasn't moral guilt in the Christian sense. It was more like contagion, something that could spread and cause harm if not properly addressed. Purification rituals, often involving water, blood, or both, were required to remove miasma. This concept shaped everything from medical practice to criminal justice. A murderer polluted not just himself, but potentially his entire community, which is why exile or execution was necessary. Women's religious participation deserves special attention. While women were largely excluded from political life in most Greek city-states, they played crucial roles in religion. Certain cults were entirely female. The Thesmophoria, a 3-day festival honouring Demeter, was celebrated only by citizen women. Men were strictly forbidden. We don't know all the details of what happened during the Thesmophoria. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague, but it apparently involved rituals relating to fertility, agriculture, and women's role as bearers of life. Priestesses served many cults. The most important priestess in Athens was the priestess of Athena Polias, who tended the ancient wooden statue of the city's patron goddess. At Delphi, the Pythia, who delivered Apollo's oracles, was always female. Many mystery cults initiated women alongside men. In some ways, religion offered women opportunities for public prominence and authority that were denied to them in political life. Children too were integrated into religious practice from birth. The Amphidromia welcomed newborns into the household. As children grew, they participated in various rites of passage that marked their progression toward adulthood. Athenian boys served as acolytes at festivals, carrying sacred implements, leading animals to sacrifice. Girls of aristocratic families might serve as arephoroi, assistants to the priestess of Athena, helping to weave the peplos presented at the Pantheon. These weren't just ceremonial roles, they were religious education, teaching children the myths, rituals and values that would shape their adult religious lives. Death, of course, required extensive religious ritual. Proper burial was essential. Without it, the dead couldn't properly enter the underworld and might linger as troubled ghosts. Funerals involved washing and preparing the body, a procession to the burial site or cremation pyre, lamentation and praise of the deceased, burial or cremation itself, and then ongoing commemoration at the grave. Offerings were left at tombs, food, wine, oil. Some families held annual festivals to honour their dead. The Greeks believed that while the soul went to the underworld, it maintained some connection to the grave, and neglecting the dead was both impious and potentially dangerous. All of this religious practice, from household rituals to grand festivals, from curse tablets to healing sanctuaries, from mystery initiations to funeral rites, formed the texture of daily Greek life. The gods weren't abstractions or Sunday-only concerns, they were constantly present, constantly relevant. Greek religion wasn't about faith in our modern sense. It was about practice, about maintaining the proper relationships with divine powers through ritual action. And it worked, or at least Greeks believed it worked. Crops grew or didn't, and you could explain either outcome by whether you'd properly honoured Demeter. Ships returned safely, or sank, depending on Poseidon's favour. Life went on, mediated at every point by divine beings who were real, present, and powerful. This was mythology lived, not just told. The stories gave framework and meaning to religious practice. The practice in turn made the stories real, relevant, immediate. A farmer sacrificing to Demeter at harvest wasn't just following tradition. He was participating in the same relationship with the goddess that had sustained his ancestors, that was written into the myths that would continue for his descendants, or so he believed. Because all of this entire rich tapestry of belief and practice, was about to be challenged and transformed by forces that Greek religion had never faced before, the conquests of Alexander the Great, and the vast cosmopolitan world that would emerge in his wake. In 336 BCE, a 20-year-old king ascended to the throne of Macedon in northern Greece. His name was Alexander, and he would change the world. Within 13 years he would conquer the Persian Empire, march his army to India, and die in Babylon at age 32, leaving behind an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus River. His conquests didn't just redraw political maps, they fundamentally transformed Greek religion and mythology. Alexander saw himself as a descendant of heroes, tracing his lineage through his mother to Achilles and through his father to Heracles. He carried a copy of the Iliad with him on campaign, reportedly sleeping with it under his pillow. When he reached Troy, he made sacrifice at the supposed tomb of Achilles, running naked around it with his companions in homage to his legendary ancestor. Alexander wasn't just a military genius. He was a believer in Greek mythology, someone who saw his conquests as a kind of divine mission, following in the footsteps of heroes and gods. But as Alexander moved east, conquering Persia, Egypt, Central Asia, and finally pushing into India, he encountered peoples with their own, ancient religious traditions. And here something remarkable happened. Rather than simply imposing Greek religion on conquered peoples, Alexander adopted a policy of cultural synthesis. He portrayed himself to Persians as the legitimate successor to their kings. In Egypt he was welcomed as pharaoh and visited the oracle of Amun-Ra at Siwa in the desert, where the priests reportedly proclaimed him the son of Zeus Ammon, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian divine kingship. This syncretism, the blending and identification of gods from different cultures, would become one of the defining features of the Hellenistic period. The 3 centuries following Alexander's death, when Greek culture spread across the Near East and Mediterranean. Egyptian gods were equated with Greek ones. Ammon became identified with Zeus, Isis with Demeter, Horus with Apollo. Persian deities found Greek equivalents. local gods throughout Alexander's empire were reinterpreted through Greek mythological frameworks. The cosmopolitan cities that grew up in the Hellenistic world fostered this religious mixing. Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander and developed by his successor Ptolemy, became the greatest city of the Hellenistic world. Its population included Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, and many others. The city's intellectual life was unmatched, centred on the great library and museum. And its religious life was equally diverse. Traditional Greek temples stood alongside Egyptian shrines and foreign cults. The Ptolemaic dynasty itself promoted the cult of Serapis, a new god who combined Greek and Egyptian elements, designed to appeal to both populations. Ruler cult emerged as a new and controversial form of religion. When Alexander was proclaimed son of Zeus at Siwa, Greek intellectuals were shocked and uncomfortable. Greeks might descend from gods. Heroes like Heracles might be apotheosized after death, but living mortals weren't gods. Yet Alexander pushed this boundary, and after his death, his successors made ruler cult standard practice. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids ruling from Syria across to Central Asia, the Antigonids in Macedon, all promoted their own divinity or near divinity. Cities built temples to these Hellenistic kings and queens, performed sacrifices to them, celebrated festivals in their honour. This created theological problems. How could a human being, however powerful, actually be divine? The answer lay in a concept called euhemerism, named after a Greek writer named Euhemerus, who theorized that the gods of mythology had originally been great kings and heroes whose accomplishments led to their deification after death. This rationalized ruler cult by suggesting it was following ancient precedent. Zeus himself might have been a great ancient king, now worshipped as supreme god. If so, why not worship present-day kings in anticipation of their eventual divine status? Traditional Greek religion didn't disappear. Far from it. Greek colonists and settlers in the new Hellenistic cities built temples to Olympian gods. Apollo, Athena, Dionysus, all the familiar deities were worshipped from the shores of the Black Sea to the banks of the Indus. Greek festivals were celebrated in Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon, Iconium. The great Panhellenic sanctuaries, Olympia, Delphi, continued to function and receive dedications from Hellenistic kings eager to show their Greek cultural credentials. But the context had changed. In the classical period, Greek religion had been tightly bound to the polis, the city-state. Your religious identity was inseparable from your civic identity. In the Hellenistic world of great kingdoms and cosmopolitan cities, this link weakened. People moved around more, lived in foreign lands, encountered diverse religious traditions. Religion became more a matter of personal choice and less a given of birth and citizenship. This contributed to the rise of mystery religions and personal cults. The Eleusinian mysteries remained popular, but they were joined by cults of Eastern deities that offered similar promises of personal salvation and afterlife blessings. Isis, the Egyptian goddess, became hugely popular across the Hellenistic world. Her cult offered moral teachings, personal devotion, and hope for the afterlife. Cybele from Anatolia, Atargatis from Syria, Mithras from Persia, though his cult would peak later under the Romans, all found Greek and Hellenized followers. Philosophy also transformed during this period. The great philosophical schools founded in Athens, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum continued, but they were joined by new schools that offered practical wisdom for navigating an uncertain world. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that the universe was governed by a rational divine principle, the Logos, and that humans should live in accordance with nature and accept their fate without complaint. The Stoics identified traditional gods as personifications of natural forces or aspects of the divine Logos. They weren't atheists, but their theology had little room for the anthropomorphic myth-telling gods of Homer. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, taught that the gods existed but were far removed from human affairs, living in perfect bliss in the spaces between worlds, They neither heard prayers nor answered them, neither punished the wicked nor rewarded the good. Religion for the Epicureans should involve honouring the gods as perfect beings worthy of contemplation, but should never involve fear or superstition or hope of divine intervention. This was a direct challenge to traditional Greek religion, which was built entirely on the idea that gods actively involved themselves in human affairs. Skepticism, particularly as developed by Carneades and others in the Academy during the Hellenistic period, questioned whether we could know anything for certain, including whether gods existed or what they were like. Cynicism rejected conventional religion as just another empty social convention. The varied philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period offered alternatives to traditional mythology, ways of understanding the world and living ethically that didn't depend on believing the literal truth of stories about Zeus's infidelities or Athena's birth. Yet traditional cult practice continued. Philosophy was for intellectuals. Most people, even educated people, continued to sacrifice at altars, participate in festivals, consult oracles. But there was a growing sense that the old certainties were weakening. The gods seemed more distant, less directly involved in human affairs, or maybe it was just that the world had become bigger, more complex, harder to navigate, and the comforting simplicities of civic religion fit less well with cosmopolitan reality. Greek art from the Hellenistic period reflects these changes. Sculptures became more emotional, more individualized, less idealized. The serene classical style gave way to something more dramatic, more realistic, sometimes even disturbing. This extended to depictions of gods. They became more human, less remote. Or conversely, they became more abstract, philosophical representations rather than anthropomorphic personalities. The Library of Alexandria collected and studied Greek texts, including Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians. Scholars called Alexandrian grammarians worked to establish definitive versions of these works, writing commentaries, interpreting difficult passages, preserving knowledge. But this scholarship also created distance. Mythology was becoming literature, an object of study rather than living belief. When scholars debated whether Homer believed his own myths, or how to interpret the allegorical meaning of various stories, they were treating mythology as text, not as religious truth. By the end of the Hellenistic period, as Roman power grew and eventually absorbed the Greek East, Greek mythology had been transformed. It had spread across the known world, mixed with countless other traditions, been reinterpreted by philosophers and scholars. It remained central to Greek cultural identity, but that identity itself was now hybrid, cosmopolitan, complicated. The old civic cults persisted, but alongside them flourished mystery religions, ruler cults, philosophical theologies, and syncretic gods that Homer wouldn't have recognized. Greek mythology had gone from being the religion of small city-states to being one component, albeit an important one, in the religious marketplace of a vast interconnected world. And that world was about to be unified under Rome. Rome's relationship with Greek culture was complicated, contradictory, and ultimately transformative for both parties. Romans conquered Greece militarily, but as the saying went, conquered Greece took her victor captive. Greek art, literature, philosophy, and religion flooded into Roman culture, reshaping it fundamentally. And Greek mythology was at the heart of this cultural conquest. The Romans had their own indigenous religious traditions, of course. They worshipped spirits of place and function, deities associated with specific activities or locations. But as Rome came into contact with Greek civilization through its colonization of southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek cities had been established for centuries, Roman religion began to change. Greek gods were identified with Roman ones, given Latin names, and absorbed into Roman religious practice. Zeus became Jupiter, the king of gods and ruler of the sky. Poseidon became Neptune, god of the sea. Hades became Pluto. Hera became Juno. Athena became Minerva. Ares became Mars. Aphrodite became Venus. Hermes became Mercury. Artemis became Diana. Hephaestus became Vulcan. Dionysus became Bacchus. The list goes on. This wasn't just renaming, it was a process of cultural appropriation and synthesis. Roman gods acquired the myths, attributes, and iconography of their Greek counterparts. When Romans told stories about Jupiter, they were telling Greek stories about Zeus, often copied directly from Greek sources. Roman poets eagerly adapted Greek mythology. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the late 1st century BCE to glorify Augustus and provide Rome with a national epic to rival the Iliad, was thoroughly steeped in Greek mythological tradition. Aeneas, a minor Trojan hero from the Iliad, became the protagonist of Rome's foundation myth, fleeing Troy with the household gods, voyaging to Italy, and establishing the lineage that would eventually found Rome. The Aeneid was Latin epic, but it used Greek mythological framework, featured Greek gods, and was in constant dialogue with Homer. Ovid's Metamorphoses, written around the same time, retold hundreds of Greek myths, organised around the theme of transformation. This sprawling poem became one of the most influential texts for transmitting Greek mythology to later ages. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans knew Greek myths primarily through Ovid, not through the Greek originals. Ovid wrote with sophistication and irony, sometimes seeming to mock the very myths he was retelling, but he preserved them nonetheless. Roman visual art similarly absorbed Greek mythological themes. Sculptures copied Greek originals or depicted scenes from Greek myth. Frescoes in Roman houses showed mythological episodes. Mosaics covered floors with images of gods, heroes, and legendary events. Roman sarcophagi were carved with elaborate mythological scenes. The gods were everywhere in Roman visual culture, borrowed wholesale from Greek tradition, but adapted to Roman tastes and purposes. But Romans didn't just passively receive Greek mythology, they made it serve Roman political and social purposes. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, promoted himself as descended from Venus through Aeneas. He built the temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, to commemorate his victory over Julius Caesar's assassins. He restored old temples and revived ancient rituals. This wasn't because Augustus was particularly pious. It was because he understood that religion could bind society together, legitimize authority, and create a sense of continuity with Rome's mythic past. Subsequent emperors followed Augustus's example. They built temples, sponsored religious festivals, and associated themselves with particular gods. Domitian promoted Minerva. Hadrian had a complicated relationship with Greek culture, simultaneously promoting Hellenism and ruling as an autocratic emperor. The Severan dynasty in the 3rd century CE brought Syrian religious influences but wrapped them in Greco-Roman mythological language. The imperial cult became increasingly important. Emperors were worshipped as gods after death, sometimes even during life. This was borrowed from Hellenistic ruler cult, but it had never been part of traditional Greek or Roman religion. It created a new category of deity, the divinized human, the emperor whose power and accomplishments elevated him beyond mortality. Temples to divine emperors were built across the empire. Priests served their cults, sacrifices were offered, and refusal to participate, to burn a bit of incense and acknowledge the emperor's divinity, could be punishable as treason. Yet for all this absorption of Greek mythology into Roman religion, Romans often claimed to be more pious than the Greeks. They prided themselves on maintaining ancient rituals exactly as their ancestors had performed them. Roman religion was conservative, focused on correct procedure rather than belief or emotion. Do the ritual right, and the gods would maintain the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, ensuring Rome's prosperity and power. This emphasis on ritual over theology meant that Romans were generally tolerant of diverse religious traditions within their empire, as long as those traditions didn't threaten public order or refuse appropriate reverence to the emperor. This brings us to one of history's great paradoxes. Rome, which had absorbed Greek mythology so thoroughly that the two traditions became almost indistinguishable, which built grand temples to the gods, which made sacrifice and ritual central to civic life, would eventually abandon all of this for a new religion that emerged from an obscure province of the empire, Christianity. And the conflict between traditional Greco-Roman religion and Christianity would determine mythology's fate. But before that final confrontation, Greek mythology under Roman rule enjoyed a kind of Indian summer. The 2nd century CE, often called the Second Sophistic, saw a revival of interest in Greek culture. Educated Romans studied Greek literature, spoke Greek fluently, travelled to Greece to see ancient sites and participate in traditional festivals. Plutarch wrote his biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, connecting the two cultures. Pausanias compiled his description of Greece, a traveller's guide to Greek monuments, temples, and religious sites, that preserved invaluable information about cults and practices. Lucian wrote satirical dialogues featuring the gods as characters, mocking mythological stories while simultaneously demonstrating their enduring cultural importance. Mystery cults flourished. The Eleusinian mysteries remained popular, now attracting initiates from across the empire. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman world. Mithraism, a mystery religion focused on the god Mithras, became hugely popular with Roman soldiers and spread to every corner of the empire. These mystery religions coexisted with traditional Greco-Roman mythology, offering something the civic cults couldn't: personal relationship with the divine, moral teaching, hope for blessed afterlife. Philosophy continued to engage with religious questions. Neoplatonism, developed by Plotinus and his followers in the 3rd century CE, offered a sophisticated theological system that reinterpreted traditional gods as levels or emanations of the One, the ultimate divine reality. Traditional myths were read as allegories for philosophical truths. This allowed educated pagans to maintain their connection to Greek mythology, while also having a philosophically respectable theology. But pressures were building. Christianity was spreading, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. And unlike the various other religions circulating in the Roman Empire, Christianity was exclusive. It demanded not just reverence, but belief. Not just participation in rituals, but rejection of all other gods. For Christians, the gods of Greco-Roman mythology weren't just false. They were demons, evil spirits deceiving humanity. This was something entirely new, a religion that didn't just disagree with traditional beliefs, but actively sought to destroy them. The stage was set for mythology's final confrontation. Greek gods had survived the Bronze Age collapse, been transformed by the Archaic and Classical periods, adapted to the Hellenistic world, absorbed by Rome. They had endured for over 2 millennia, but now they faced an enemy unlike any they'd encountered before, a religion that offered eternal salvation and demanded total commitment, backed increasingly by imperial power. The twilight of the gods was approaching. Christianity emerged in the 1st century CE as a small Jewish sect in the Roman province of Judea. At first, it seemed like one more minor religious movement in a world full of them. But Christianity had characteristics that would eventually make it the most successful religion in Roman history. It was monotheistic, claiming there was only one true God. It was missionary, actively seeking converts. It offered moral teaching, community support, and promise of eternal life. And crucially, it was democratic, open to anyone regardless of social status, gender, or ethnicity. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, Christianity grew slowly but steadily, particularly in urban areas. Christians were a small minority, perhaps 5 to 10% of the empire's population by 300 CE. Traditional Greco-Roman religion remained dominant. Temples were maintained, festivals celebrated, sacrifices performed. But Christianity's exclusivist claims put it on a collision course with traditional religion. Christians refused to participate in traditional religious practices. They wouldn't sacrifice to the emperor. They avoided festivals honouring the gods. They called the traditional gods demons. To Roman authorities and pagan philosophers, this looked like atheism, the denial of the gods. Worse, it looked like disloyalty to Rome itself, since traditional religion was bound up with civic identity and political order. How could the gods protect Rome if Romans refused to honour them? This led to periodic persecutions, local, sporadic at first, becoming more systematic under certain emperors. The persecutions weren't constant or universal. Most Christians most of the time weren't actively hunted, but the threat was real. Christians might be arrested, forced to sacrifice to the gods or face punishment. Those who refused became martyrs, witnesses to their faith unto death. These martyrdoms, while tragic for the individuals involved, became powerful tools for Christian propaganda. Here were people so committed to their beliefs that they died rather than compromise, demonstrating Christianity's truth and power. Pagan intellectuals responded to Christianity with a mixture of contempt, curiosity, and eventually alarm. The philosopher Celsus, writing in the late 2nd century, attacked Christianity as a religion for the ignorant, noting that it appealed primarily to women, slaves, and the uneducated. He defended traditional religion, arguing that the gods had been worshipped for centuries and were an integral part of civilization. Porphyry, in the 3rd century, wrote an extensive critique of Christianity, attacking Christian scripture, mocking Christian beliefs, and defending philosophical paganism, but Christianity kept growing, and it had advantages. Christian communities provided support for their members, caring for the sick, helping the poor, offering a sense of belonging in an often hostile world. Christian moral teaching was clear and uncompromising, where traditional philosophy could seem abstract or elitist. Christian promise of salvation and resurrection offered hope beyond the grim traditional afterlife of shadows and gloom. And Christian communities were tightly organised, with bishops exercising authority over networks of churches, creating an institutional structure that traditional paganism, with its multitude of independent cults, couldn't match. Then came Constantine. In 312 CE, Constantine fought a battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome against a rival for imperial power. Before the battle, Constantine reportedly had a vision or dream involving a Christian symbol, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won the battle and attributed his victory to the Christian god. In 313, Constantine, along with his co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, which granted Christians legal recognition and ended persecution. Christianity went from persecuted minority to legally protected religion overnight. Constantine's conversion, however genuine or politically motivated it might have been, transformed the religious landscape. The emperor began to favour Christianity, building churches, giving privileges to Christian clergy, involving himself in Christian doctrinal disputes. He didn't immediately ban traditional religion. Temples remained open, sacrifices continued, the old festivals were still celebrated. Constantine himself retained the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the traditional Roman state religion. But the balance had shifted dramatically. Traditional religion lost its privileged position. Imperial patronage flowed to churches, not temples. The resources that might have maintained pagan cult buildings and supported pagan priests increasingly went to Christian institutions. The symbolic importance of an emperor favouring Christianity was enormous. For centuries, emperors had sacrificed to the gods, attended traditional festivals, built temples. Now the emperor was Christian. What did that say about the old god's power? Not everyone converted. Far from it. The pagan aristocracy of Rome remained largely loyal to traditional religion. Many philosophers continued to defend and practice it. Rural areas, less affected by urban Christian communities, remained predominantly pagan. The word pagan itself, from Latin paganus, meaning rural dweller or country person, reflects this urban-rural divide. Christianity was initially a city religion. The countryside held to older ways longer, but the pressure increased. Constantine's sons, Constantius II and Constans, issued laws restricting pagan practices. The Emperor Julian, called the apostate by Christian writers, briefly tried to revive traditional religion when he took power in 361. Julian had been raised Christian but converted to philosophical paganism. As emperor, he tried to reorganize pagan cult along Christian lines, creating a pagan priesthood with hierarchy and moral authority, promoting traditional philosophy and sacrifice. He wrote polemics against Christianity. He rebuilt temples and reinstated pagan privileges. Julian's reign lasted less than 2 years. He died on campaign against Persia in 363, and his pagan revival died with him. His successors returned to favouring Christianity. The window for traditional religion's revival had closed. Theodosius Theirs completed what Constantine had begun. In 380, he made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the empire. In 391-392, he issued decrees effectively banning traditional pagan practices. Sacrifice was prohibited. Temples were closed or appropriated for Christian use. Participation in pagan festivals could be punished. The old gods were officially rejected, but laws on parchment don't immediately change culture. Traditional religion persisted, sometimes openly, often secretly. The great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries remained important pilgrimage sites. Philosophers continued to teach Neoplatonism, which maintained connections to traditional mythology through allegory. Rural areas continued their ancestral practices largely undisturbed, at least for a while. Christian mobs, encouraged by zealous bishops, sometimes destroyed temples and cult statues. The famous statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders, was eventually destroyed. The temple of Serapis at Alexandria was torn down by Christian rioters led by the patriarch Theophilus in 391. Sacred groves were cut down. Statues of gods were defaced or broken. Books considered pagan were burned. Yet destruction wasn't universal or systematic. Many temples were simply abandoned, left to decay from neglect rather than destroyed by violence. Some were converted into churches. Christian sacred space built literally atop pagan foundations. The Parthenon in Athens became a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The Erechtheion on the Acropolis was also Christianized. The Temple of Athena at Syracuse became a cathedral. This architectural transformation symbolized the religious one. The old gods were being replaced, their houses repurposed for the new faith. Mystery cults held on longer than civic religion. The Eleusinian mysteries, which had offered spiritual fulfillment for over 1,000 years, continued to initiate people into the secrets of Demeter and Persephone. But in 396, Visigoths led by Alaric destroyed much of the sanctuary at Eleusis. The mysteries might have continued in some form after this, but increasingly Christianity controlled the levers of power, and secret pagan rites were becoming dangerous. Philosophy provided the last significant intellectual defense of traditional religion. The Neoplatonist Proclus in the 5th century wrote hymns to the gods and commentaries on Plato that interpreted traditional mythology allegorically. He saw the myths as encoded wisdom about the nature of reality and the soul's journey toward the divine. This was sophisticated, philosophically respectable paganism, very different from simple belief in anthropomorphic gods, but it maintained a connection to Greek mythological tradition. In 529, the Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools in Athens, including Plato's Academy, which had been operating for nearly 1,000 years. This was a symbolic death blow to philosophical paganism. The last major institutional centres of traditional learning were silenced. Some philosophers fled to Persia, where they were received at the court of the Sasanian emperor. Others retired to private life. The public intellectual tradition that had maintained and transformed Greek mythology for a millennium was cut off. By the 6th century, traditional Greco-Roman religion was dying. Christianity had won, not just legally, but socially and culturally. To be an educated person, to participate in civic life, to have a future, required being Christian. The old gods were becoming literary references, not living presences. Their temples were ruins or churches. Their festivals had been replaced by Christian holy days. Their priests were gone. Their myths were being reinterpreted as allegory or dismissed as demon-inspired lies. But the gods didn't die immediately or completely. In remote areas, traditional practices continued. The Maniots in Greece's southern peninsula reportedly held out against Christianity until the 9th century. Rural shrines and folk practices often blended elements of old and new religion. Festivals might be celebrated with Christian names but retain pagan elements. And intellectually, Greek mythology remained important. Christian scholars studied Homer and Hesiod, the tragedians and philosophers. They taught Greek literature in Christian schools. They borrowed mythological imagery even while rejecting mythological beliefs. The twilight was deep, but not yet total darkness. One more act remained in mythology's long story, not its violent suppression that was nearly complete, but its transformation into something else, not living religion, but literary tradition, not believed, but remembered, studied, endlessly mined for imagery and meaning by a culture that had rejected it, but couldn't quite let it go. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, traditional Greco-Roman religion as a lived practice had essentially ended in most of the former Roman Empire. Churches stood where temples had fallen. Bishops replaced priests. The Christian liturgical calendar determined feast days, not the old festival calendar of sacrifices and processions. For the vast majority of people in what was becoming medieval Europe, the gods of Greek mythology were no more real than characters in old stories, which is in fact exactly what they had become. But those old stories survived. Christian scholars might reject pagan religion, but they couldn't reject Greek culture entirely. Greek and Latin were the languages of education. The classical authors, Homer, Virgil, Ovid, the philosophers and historians, were still studied. This created a strange contradiction. Christians learning their grammar from pagan poets, practicing their rhetoric with mythological examples, absorbing a classical education steeped in references to gods they officially didn't believe in. The solution was allegory. Christian scholars developed elaborate systems of allegorical interpretation that allowed them to study classical literature while claiming to extract Christian moral lessons from it. When Ovid told of Orpheus descending to the underworld to reclaim his dead wife Eurydice, this wasn't just an entertaining story about a mythical singer. It was an allegory for Christ's harrowing of hell, or the soul's struggle against death. When Homer described the wrath of Achilles, this became a moral lesson about the dangers of excessive anger. The gods themselves were reinterpreted as representations of moral virtues or vices, natural forces, or in some cases, as demons who had deceived ancient pagans but whose stories could still teach Christians what to avoid. This allegorical approach preserved Greek mythology while transforming it beyond recognition. The stories remained, but divorced from any religious meaning. They became moral fables, literary ornaments, classical heritage to be treasured but not believed. The educated medieval scholar might know all about Zeus and Athena, might have read the Iliad in Greek and the Metamorphoses in Latin, but would no more worship these gods than worship characters from a novel. Some Greek texts were preserved because they were copied and recopied by Byzantine and later Islamic scholars. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that survived the Western Empire's collapse, maintained Greek as its primary language and preserved much of ancient Greek literature. Byzantine scholars copied Homer, Hesiod, the playwrights, historians, and philosophers. They wrote commentaries, compiled encyclopedias, maintained the textual tradition. For them, this wasn't dead culture. It was their heritage, the foundation of their identity, even though they were Orthodox Christians who wouldn't dream of sacrificing to Zeus. In the Islamic world, which conquered much of the former Byzantine territory in the 7th and 8th centuries, Greek texts were translated into Arabic. Islamic scholars studied Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, Plato, and the Neoplatonists. They were less interested in mythology as such, but they preserved and transmitted many classical texts that would eventually make their way back to Latin Europe through Spain and Sicily. When Latin Europe emerged from its own dark ages in the 12th and 13th centuries, the renaissance of classical learning began. Greek texts that had survived in Byzantine manuscripts, Latin texts that had been preserved in monastic libraries, began to circulate more widely. Universities taught classical literature. Scholastic philosophers engaged with Aristotle and Plato. And Greek mythology entered European consciousness in new ways. Artists depicted mythological scenes. Poets retold mythological stories. Humanist scholars sought out ancient manuscripts, translating them, commenting on them, treating classical antiquity as a golden age of learning and culture to be emulated. But this wasn't revival of Greek religion. It was appreciation of Greek culture. The Renaissance rediscovered classical mythology as art and literature, not as theology. This transformation was completed in the 18th and 19th centuries as modern classical scholarship developed. Homer became not divine revelation but an object of textual criticism. Scholars debated the Homeric question: was Homer one person or many? When were the poems composed? How did oral tradition work? Hesiod's Theogony was analysed as a historical document showing religious development, not as literal truth about divine genealogy. Greek myths were collected, compared, studied as anthropology, as psychology, as literature, as history of ideas. The discipline of mythology itself, the comparative study of myths from different cultures, emerged in the 19th century. Scholars noticed parallels between Greek myths and those of other Indo-European peoples, suggesting common origins in prehistoric times. Folklorists collected stories that showed how ancient mythological motifs survived in fairy tales and folk traditions. Psychologists from Freud to Jung interpreted myths as expressions of unconscious psychological truths. Anthropologists saw them as encoding social structures and values. All of this scholarship, all this interest, showed that Greek mythology remained culturally powerful long after anyone believed in it literally. Artists continued to paint mythological scenes. Poets rewrote classical myths. James Joyce structured Ulysses around the Odyssey. Countless novels, plays, films have adapted Greek mythological themes. Fantasy literature borrows freely from Greek monsters, heroes, and gods. Superhero comics explicitly echo mythological storytelling structures. Even the names persist. Planets are named for Roman versions of Greek gods. Months remember their divine namesakes. Businesses use classical names to suggest power, wisdom, beauty. Aphrodite for cosmetics, Athena for educational institutions, Mercury for speed. Psychological concepts like narcissism, the Oedipus complex, Electra complex all reference Greek mythology. We still say someone has an Achilles heel, or describe an impressive journey as an Odyssey, or call a beautiful woman a Venus. In this sense, Greek mythology never really died. It transformed from living religion to cultural heritage, from belief to literature, from worship to study. The gods lost their power to grant prayers or send plagues, but they gained a different kind of immortality, the immortality of influential ideas that shape how cultures think, speak, and imagine. Today you can visit the ruins of Greek temples. The Parthenon still stands on the Acropolis, battered by time, war, pollution, but still recognizable. You can walk through Olympia and Delphi, see the stones where the ancient games were held, where Apollo's oracle spoke. Museums around the world display statues of the gods, painted pottery showing mythological scenes, architectural fragments that once adorned sacred buildings. These ruins, these artifacts are all that physically remains of Greek religion as it was actually practiced. But in books, in art, in our cultural imagination, the gods are still alive in their way, not as objects of worship, but as powerful symbols, compelling characters, enduring stories. When you encounter Zeus or Athena in a novel, a painting, a film, you're experiencing the afterlife of Greek mythology. The ancient Greeks believed the soul survived death to enter the shadowy underworld. Their gods have done the same, surviving in a twilight realm between religion and literature, no longer worshipped but never quite forgotten. The rise and fall of Greek mythology, from Bronze Age palaces to classical temples to Christian churches, spans 3,000 years of human history. It was born in darkness, flourished in light, and returned to darkness again. But darkness doesn't mean nothingness. The myths survive, the stories persist, the names echo on. Greek mythology died as religion, but it was reborn as something else, as cultural heritage, as eternal questions about gods and heroes, fate and freedom, mortality and meaning, told in stories so powerful that they've outlived every empire that ever adopted them, outlived every god that was ever worshipped, to become part of the permanent inheritance of human civilization. The gods are dead. Long live the gods.